Senator John Kennedy gets fined $500 by Judge Thomas, but Kennedy turns the whole court against him. The gavel slammed twice its sharp crack, echoing through the cavernous courtroom like a thunderclap. Order in the court. High above, behind a towering mahogany bench, Judge Clarence Thomas presided, his face an unreadable mask, his voice as cold and unyielding as the marble pillars that framed the chamber. Senator John Kennedy, he declared, each word deliberate, heavy with intent. You have defied this court's orders. Repeatedly. This body is authorized to fine you $500 million. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Reporters in the back, their pens poised like startled birds, froze mid-scribble. The gallery, packed with onlookers, held its breath. $500 million. The number wasn't just a penalty, it was a guillotine crafted not to punish, but to obliterate. It was a sum designed to end Senator Kennedy's career, to silence his voice in the Senate, to send a message to anyone who dared challenge the system. The attorneys, seasoned and stoic, exchanged glances, their eyes betraying not shock, but disbelief. The figure was symbolic, a public execution draped in the robes of justice. Yet John Kennedy, the senior senator from Louisiana, sat perfectly still in his chair. No twitch, no sigh, no flicker of fear crossed his weathered face. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Thomas, a quiet defiance radiating from his posture, his hands folded calmly on the table before him. The courtroom, grand and imposing, seemed to shrink under the weight of his stillness. Slowly, Kennedy rose, his tailored suit, crisp, his movements measured like a man who'd faced storms and walked through them unscathed. His southern drawl, rich and deliberate, cut through the silence like a blade. "Are you finished, Your Honor?" A gasp rippled through the gallery, sharp and involuntary. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, the gavel still in his grip. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, edged with irritation. Kennedy didn't flinch. "I said, are you finished, sir? Because I'm not." The courtroom buzzed, a low hum of shock, swelling into murmurs of anticipation. Reporters scribbled furiously now, their pens scratching like a chorus of cicadas. Kennedy reached into his briefcase, pulling out a single folder, slim, unassuming, with a plain yellow tab that belied its weight. He walked to the clerk's desk with the calm of a man delivering a routine memo, not a bomb that could upend the room. "Please enter this into the record," he said, handing it over with no urgency, as if returning a library book long overdue. The clerk, a young woman with wide eyes, fumbled the folder, her hands trembling slightly. What is this?" she stammered. Kennedy's voice was steady, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of certainty. Facts, sworn affidavits, financial records, internal memos. All dated, all verified. He turned back to Thomas, whose knuckles whitened around the gavel. "With respect, Justice Thomas, these documents show you hold financial interests in 3 of the 4 private entities that lobbied for this fine to be imposed." The room shook not with sound, but with realization. A reporter's tablet clattered to the floor, the noise sharp against the stunned silence. A man in the gallery stood, then sat as if the gravity of Kennedy's words had pulled him back down. Thomas's face paled, his jaw tightening, but his voice remained defiant. "This is absurd," he said, the words clipped, fraying at the edges. Kennedy didn't waver, his gaze unyielding. "It's math, sir. Simple connections. You should have recused yourself from this case, but you didn't. And now we know why." The gavel slammed again, a desperate bid for control. Silence. Thomas barked, his voice echoing off the walls, but the silence was already broken. Kennedy's eyes never left him. "The silence is over, Your Honor. You've turned this courtroom into a weapon, but you forgot something. I don't scare easy." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, no longer gasps, but a swelling tide of support. A court officer stepped forward, uncertain, his hand hovering near his belt. Another judge on the bench, older and grayer, leaned over, whispering urgently to his colleague. Thomas shook his head, his authority cracking like thin ice under a boot. "This court will recess," he declared, his voice strained, almost brittle. Kennedy didn't sit. He turned to the gallery, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, reporters, citizens, aides, and onlookers who'd come expecting a spectacle, but found themselves witnessing history. "If you've ever been told to sit down, shut up and take it," he said, his drawl slow and deliberate. "Pay attention now. This isn't about me. It's about what happens when someone refuses to bow to those who think they're untouchable." A man in the gallery stood, his face resolute. Then a woman, her hands clasped tightly. A row of observers rose, silent but defiant, their presence a quiet rebellion against the weight of the robes behind the bench. Kennedy turned back to Thomas. "You want to fine me $500 million to teach me a lesson. Here's mine: never walk into a room where the rules are written to silence you. Rewrite the rules." Thomas's hand hovered over the gavel, but he didn't strike. The clerk, still clutching Kennedy's folder, stood abruptly, her voice trembling but clear. "Your Honor, I've reviewed the documents. They appear legitimate, detailed." Another judge leaned over, his whisper sharp and urgent. A third reached for the phone on the bench, his fingers moving quickly. Thomas's composure fractured, his eyes darting to the folder, then to Kennedy, then to the gallery, now alive with whispers and movement. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he snapped, rising from his seat, his robes swishing as he moved toward the door. Kennedy's voice stopped him cold. "One more thing, Your Honor." Thomas froze, half-turned his hand on the doorframe. Kennedy's tone was calm, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of a promise. "That folder, copies are already with the Ethics Committee, 2 federal investigative agencies, and every major news outlet in the country." The door behind the bench clicked open, but Thomas didn't move. The gallery buzzed not with scandal, but with clarity. For the first time in that courtroom, the robes weren't the loudest presence. The truth was, Kennedy continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "You thought I came here to defend myself, sir. I didn't. I came to defend the people you've tried to silence with your position. The people who deserve a system that serves justice, not power." Thomas's shoulders stiffened, but he said nothing. He turned, his footsteps heavy, and the door slammed shut behind him. The gallery erupted not in cheers, but in a low, steady hum of voices, like a storm gathering strength. Kennedy sat, his face unreadable, his hands steady on the table. The other judges whispered among themselves, their faces tight with unease. One, a senior judge with silver hair and deep lines etched into his face, leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Senator Kennedy, we'll reconvene in 15 minutes after reviewing your materials." Kennedy nodded, a single dip of his chin, his eyes fixed on the empty chair where Thomas had sat. Outside, the courthouse steps were already swarming. Camera flashes lit up the morning air. Reporters shouted questions, and a crowd gathered students with phones, out locals drawn by the news. Even a few congressional staffers slipping through the side entrance to witness what was unfolding. Upstairs, Kennedy stood by a window on the second floor, sipping water from a paper cup, one hand in his pocket, watching the growing chaos below. His aide, a young man with a clipboard and a nervous energy, leaned in. "How many cameras out there now?" Senator Kennedy's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Doesn't matter, son. This isn't about the lens. It's about the record." His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it, the kind forged in decades of navigating political battles, and standing firm. He turned back to the window, his eyes scanning the crowd. Some held signs hastily scrawled, "Truth over power." Others stood quietly, their phones recording their faces expectant. Kennedy knew this wasn't just a moment. It was a pivot point, one that could reshape how the public saw the courts, the law, and the men who wielded it. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Two judges returned to the bench, but Thomas's seat remained empty, his nameplate untouched, his gavel still. The senior judge, visibly uncomfortable, tapped the microphone, the sound sharp in the hushed room. "We're reconvening. The court acknowledges the new material introduced by Senator Kennedy. We have questions." The air grew heavier, not with panic, but with the weight of inevitability. Kennedy wasn't on trial anymore. The system was. The prosecutor, a man with a neatly pressed suit and a nervous tick in his jaw, spoke next, his voice reluctant. "Given the contents of the material, which suggest a significant conflict of interest by Justice Thomas, we recommend suspending enforcement of the financial penalty until an independent review is completed." Gasps rippled through the gallery, quieter now, but no less stunned. Kennedy nodded once, as if he'd already mapped this moment in his mind. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice even almost soft. "I trust the process when it's clean." The prosecutor tried to regain his footing. "This doesn't absolve the allegations against you, Senator." Kennedy cut in his drawl, sharp but controlled. "Those allegations were drafted by lobbying firms tied to entities Justice Thomas has investments in." "That's not an allegation, sir. That's a paper trail." "Paper." A junior judge, younger and less guarded, leaned toward the microphone. "Would you be willing to provide digital access to the raw data?" Already sent. Kennedy's response was immediate, his tone matter-of-fact. "You'll find a secure link in the court's inbox. Everything's there." The clerk, now pale and visibly shaken, stepped forward again. "I've accessed the link," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The materials check out. Timestamps are verified." Kennedy remained standing, his presence filling the room without effort. "Let the record show I didn't come here for pity," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry to the back of the gallery. "I came because power unchecked becomes poison. You don't fix poison by whispering about it. You expose it to light." The gallery shifted not with applause, but with focus, every eye locked on the senator who'd turned a fine into a reckoning. The senior judge paused, his fingers drumming lightly on the bench, weighing every syllable. "The court will now move to suspend the prior ruling in full pending the outcome of this investigation." The doors opened and Thomas re-entered, but something had changed. He wore no robe, just a dark suit, his shoulders tense, his stride uneven. The room stilled. The senior judge looked confused, his voice sharp. "Justice Thomas, this court is already in session." Thomas ignored him, walking straight to Kennedy's table. For the first time, they stood eye to eye, no bench, no elevation, no echo of authority. "This is a misunderstanding," Thomas said, his voice low, almost pleading. Kennedy didn't blink. "It's a system, sir. One not built for folks like me to fight back." "But I fought." Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it, his jaw tight. "You think this will help your reputation?" he said, softer now, almost a whisper. Kennedy stepped closer, his voice steady, his drawl cutting through the tension. "I reminded a justice that power is borrowed and the people hold the deed." The gallery stood again, not coordinated but aligned, as if they all felt the ground shift beneath them. Thomas turned his steps, quicker now, walking past the reporters, past the court officers, past the cameras that once framed him as untouchable. Kennedy sat his breath, even his hands still on the table. The judge tapped the microphone once more. The court will enter temporary dismissal of the $500 million penalty pending a full audit of judicial conflicts. Kennedy nodded, his eyes fixed forward, no trace of triumph, only resolve. Outside, the crowd had grown to hundreds, their chants rising, not loud, but unified. Truth, people, power. Kennedy walked out through the main doors, not escorted, not protected, but followed not by bodyguards, but by a movement that was only beginning to take shape. The courthouse doors swung open once more, the heavy wood creaking under the push of hurried footsteps, pulling every eye back to the elevated bench where the drama had paused. The 15-minute recess had dragged into nearly an hour, the air in the grand chamber thick with unspoken tension, whispers snaking through the packed gallery like vines climbing a forgotten wall. Senator John Kennedy strode back to his seat at the defendant's table, his briefcase clutched firmly, his expression as unshakable as the oak trees lining Louisiana's bayous. The senior judge, now presiding with a furrowed brow and flanked by his colleagues who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, cleared his throat into the microphone, the feedback squealing briefly before settling. "We've had time to preliminarily review the materials submitted, Senator Kennedy. You may proceed with any additional statements or evidence." Kennedy rose smoothly, his silver hair catching the light from the high windows, his southern drawl rolling out calm, but laced with an undeniable purpose that commanded the room. "Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate the court's attention to these matters. And yes, I do have more to enter into the record evidence that builds on what we've already established." He snapped open his briefcase with a click that echoed like a punctuation mark, drawing out another folder. This one thicker than the first, its edges slightly worn from the meticulous preparation that had gone into assembling it overnight. The gallery leaned forward as one, a collective breath held in anticipation. Kennedy held the folder aloft for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in visually before speaking. These documents include detailed memos from private strategy sessions and records of undisclosed dinners between Justice Thomas and senior executives from the very lobbying firms that pushed for this exorbitant fine against me. Murmurs erupted immediately, a low rumble building into a wave of gasps that crashed against the courtroom walls. Thomas, re-entering through a discreet side door, his face flushed with a mix of anger and unease, took his seat reluctantly at the far end of the bench, his eyes deliberately avoiding Kennedy's piercing gaze. "This is nothing but a continuation of the baseless smear campaign," Thomas interjected, his voice tight and defensive, the words tumbling out faster than his usual measured cadence. Kennedy didn't raise his volume, but his response cut through the noise like a well-honed knife. "It's evidence, sir. Hard, verifiable evidence. Take this sealed memo, for instance, recommending targeted sanctions against vocal senators like myself, with language that mirrors your written opinion almost word for word. And just 3 months prior, records show you dined with leaders from Willcraftoft Holdings, a firm with direct stakes in the outcomes you're ruling on. Tax filings and internal emails confirm it all." The room seemed to tilt, a reporter in the back row fumbling his notebook, sending it skittering across the floor with a sharp clatter that punctuated the shock. Thomas leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the bench. "You're deflecting from your own clear violations of court orders, Senator." Kennedy shook his head slowly, his gaze unwavering, a quiet strength emanating from his stance. "No, Your Honor. I'm exposing how power can hide in the shadows, twisting justice to serve personal interests. You've turned this courtroom into a tool for silencing dissent. But, as I've always said, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and these documents are the light we need." The gallery wasn't content to stay silent anymore. A woman in the third row stood abruptly, clapping once, then twice her applause, sparking others, before a court officer motioned her down with a stern look, but the spark had ignited, and the fire of support began to spread. Kennedy turned slightly toward the onlookers, addressing them without fully turning his back on the bench, his voice carrying the warmth of a fireside chat mixed with the steel of conviction. Folks, this isn't just some courtroom drama playing out for entertainment. It's about the abuse of authority that touches every American who believes in fair play and equal justice under the law. When judges tie their rulings to hidden financial gains, justice becomes a commodity bought and sold in back rooms, not a right upheld in open courts. The murmurs transformed into nods of agreement. A man in the front row whispering urgently to his neighbor. "He's right." Finally, someone's calling it out. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swollen, dramatically signs waving in the breeze. Kennedy for truth and no more hidden deals. Reporters clustered around makeshift podiums, their voices urgent and breathless as they live-streamed the unfolding events. Breaking news from inside Senator Kennedy accuses Justice Thomas of deep conflicts, documents now in play, and the court is reeling. Kennedy handed the new folder to the clerk, who accepted it with hands that were steadier this time, perhaps bolstered by the shifting tide in the room. "Please enter these into the record as well," Kennedy instructed politely. "And for the court's information, digital copies are already en route to the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Department of Justice, and several independent oversight bodies." Thomas slammed the gavel down, but the strike lacked its former authority, the sound coming across as hollow and desperate. "This is out of order, Senator. You're turning this proceeding into a circus." Kennedy's response was measured, almost kind in its delivery, but it landed with impact. "Order is precisely what we're restoring here, Your Honor. By shining a bright light on these unethical ties, we're ensuring the scales of justice tip fairly for everyone, not just the powerful." The other judges on the bench exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an older woman with wire-rimmed glasses, picking up the phone discreetly and whispering into it, her words lost in the growing hum of the room. Thomas's face hardened further, but the cracks in his composure were visible now, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his robes, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. As the session dragged on into the afternoon, Kennedy didn't relent laying out timelines and connections with the precision of a seasoned legislator who knew how to build a case brick by brick. Here's an email chain for the record, direct from lobbying executives to what appears to be Justice Thomas's private account, discussing neutralizing vocal senators ahead of key votes. That's not impartial justice. That's calculated strategy to protect vested interests. The prosecutor, now visibly sweating under his collar, interjected weakly, his voice lacking conviction. We'll need time to verify these claims, Your Honor." Kennedy nodded graciously. "By all means, take the time. But the American people deserve transparency right now, not delays that let shadows linger." The gallery buzzed even louder, the support swelling into open declarations. A young lawyer in the back row stood tall, his voice carrying, "We're with you, Senator Kennedy. Keep fighting." Court officers shifted uncomfortably on their feet, glancing at each other, but no one moved to silence the crowd. The momentum had shifted too far. Thomas tried once more to regain control, his voice rising. "Senator, your tactics are nothing but political theater, designed to undermine this institution." Kennedy's eyes met Thomas's directly, a spark of unyielding resolve in them. "Theater? No, sir. This is accountability in action. You thought slapping me with a $500 million fine would break my spirit and silence my voice, but all it's done is break the facade of impartiality wide open." The whispers in the gallery turned to open agreement, the room tilting decisively in Kennedy's favor as more people rose to their feet, not in disruption, but in solidarity. He paused for a beat, letting the moment breathe, allowing the weight of his words to settle like dust after a storm. I've already forwarded these materials to additional investigative bodies because this issue goes far beyond one case or one senator. It's a pattern that erodes public trust in our most sacred institutions, and it's time we addressed it head-on. Thomas abruptly left the bench, visibly shaken, prompting the senior judge to call a brief adjournment to review new evidence. Outside Kennedy's aide informed him that media coverage and public support were surging, but Kennedy remained focused. It's not about headlines, it's about fixing a broken system. When court resumed, the absence of Thomas was deeply felt. The senior judge escalated the matter to federal oversight, and Kennedy called for sweeping judicial reforms, financial disclosures, independent ethics reviews, and stricter recusal rules, earning quiet nods of bipartisan support and headlines praising his leadership. Cornered, the prosecutor agreed to delay enforcement of the fine, and support for Kennedy grew throughout the day, with constituents, senators, and news outlets across the spectrum applauding his principled stand. Meeting with his team, Kennedy emphasized the next step: systemic reform to eliminate hidden influences. As the court clerk confirmed evidence of clear conflicts, the gallery responded with hopeful applause. Kennedy's closing words, "Real reform starts today," marked a powerful shift, as even Thomas, returning briefly, seemed diminished. Kennedy had not only exposed corruption, but sparked a national movement for lasting change. The courtroom doors swung shut with a heavy thud, but the silence that followed was anything but calm, crackling with the electricity of a storm about to break. Senator John Kennedy sat at the defendant's table, his briefcase closed, his hands folded, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room as if measuring the weight of every glance and whisper. The gallery was packed tighter than ever, standing room only, with reporters spilling into the aisles, their cameras clicking like a swarm of restless insects. The senior judge, now leading the proceedings in Justice Clarence Thomas's conspicuous absence, tapped the microphone, the sharp sound cutting through the low hum. We reconvene to address the new evidence submitted by Senator Kennedy. The court is prepared to hear further arguments. Kennedy rose, his southern drawl steady, carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd already shifted the ground beneath the bench. "Thank you, Your Honor. I have no arguments today, just truth backed by a recording that speaks louder than any speech I could give." He reached into his jacket pocket, producing a small USB drive, its metallic glint catching the light as he handed it to the clerk. This is a 47-second audio clip, anonymously delivered but forensically verified, capturing Justice Thomas in a strategy session discussing the fine against me as a deliberate tactic to silence my voice. The gallery erupted in gasps, a woman dropping her phone with a clatter, the sound sharp against the stunned hush. The senior judge's brow furrowed, his voice cautious. "Senator, you're alleging a recorded conspiracy by a sitting justice?" Kennedy nodded, his expression unshaken. "Not alleging, Your Honor, proving." The clip reveals Justice Thomas and a lobbying strategist discussing how to make me radioactive before key Senate votes. It's not personal. It's a calculated move to protect hidden interests. Thomas, entering late through a side door, his suit rumpled and his face pale, froze, mid-step, his eyes darting to the USB drive now in the clerk's hands. "This is an outrage," he sputtered, his voice fraying. "That recording, if it exists, is doctored, taken out of context." Kennedy didn't flinch, his tone calm but piercing. "Then let the court play it, sir. Let the people hear your own words." The clerk, her hands steady now, inserted the drive into a laptop, and after a tense pause, Thomas's voice filled the room. "He thinks this is about him." Let him run wild, we'll drown him in noise before anyone hears the facts. The fine is bait. Hit him hard, make him look greedy, then watch him cave. Laughter followed low and chilling before the clip cut off. The gallery exploded, not in cheers, but in a roar of disbelief. Reporters scrambling to type, one shouting into a phone. "It's verified." Thomas's voice. No edits. Thomas slammed his fist on the bench, not the gavel, his composure shattered. This is a fabrication. Kennedy stepped forward, his voice even but unyielding. "It's your voice, Your Honor, verified by 2 independent audio labs. And that's just the teaser. I have the full 61-minute recording with timestamps, names, and more voices, yours included. I'm giving you 48 hours to tell the truth to the American people, or I'll release it all." The room shook again. A man in the back, standing shouting, "Give it to him!" Kennedy court officers moved to quiet him, but the tide was turning too fast. The senior judge raised a hand, his face grim. "Order, Senator. You understand the gravity of this action." Kennedy nodded, his eyes locked on Thomas. "I do, Your Honor. That's why I've already sent the full recording to the Senate Ethics Committee, the DOJ, and 3 oversight bodies. This isn't about one fine. It's about a system that lets power weaponize process against the people's voice." Thomas's face drained of color, his hands gripping the bench as if to steady himself. "You're waging war on this court," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. Kennedy's response was swift, his drawl sharp. "No, sir. I'm reminding this court that it answers to the people, not the other way around." The gallery was no longer a passive audience. It was a force rising to its feet, not in chaos, but in alignment, their murmurs a chorus of support. Outside the courthouse steps had become a sea of bodies, hundreds, then thousands, with signs reading, "Kennedy speaks truth and no more secrets." Reporters clustered their live feeds, frantic. Breaking Senator Kennedy, drops bombshell audio, Thomas implicated in targeted fine. Social media erupted hashtags like #Kennedy tapes and #Justice unraveled, trending globally within minutes. Kennedy turned to the gallery, his voice rising just enough to carry. "This isn't about me standing here today. It's about every American who's been told their voice doesn't matter. When a justice uses their gavel to protect private interests over public good, we all lose. That's why I'm calling for reforms, mandatory disclosures, independent audits, and real consequences for conflicts." A woman in the front row clapped, tears in her eyes, and others joined the sound swelling until the senior judge banged his own gavel. "Enough! This court will recess to review the audio evidence." In the hallway, Kennedy's aide rushed to him, phone glowing with notifications. "Senator, it's everywhere, CNN, Fox, BBC. They're calling it the Kennedy ultimatum. Your approval's spiking 75% in the latest flash poll." Kennedy waved it off, his focus razor-sharp. "Polls don't fix broken systems. We need to keep the pressure on." Back in the courtroom, the mood had shifted irreversibly. The senior judge returned, his face drawn. "The preliminary review confirms the audio's authenticity. We're escalating this to federal oversight immediately." Kennedy nodded, then addressed the room again. "I'm not here to tear down institutions. I'm here to rebuild trust. That starts with accountability, and I'm prepared to lead that charge." A fellow senator watching from the sidelines stepped forward, offering a rare nod of respect across party lines. Reporters scribbled, "Kennedy galvanizes bipartisan support for judicial overhaul." The prosecutor, now visibly rattled, tried to pivot. "This doesn't negate the original charges against you, Senator." Kennedy's response was swift, his drawl laced with steel. "Those charges were drafted by the same firms tied to Justice Thomas's investments. Follow the money, and you'll see the truth. As the session extended into the evening, pressure intensified. The Department of Justice confirmed it was urgently reviewing Kennedy's evidence, while the Senate Judiciary Committee announced emergency hearings with Kennedy as a key witness. When Thomas reappeared visibly diminished, his attempt to speak was lost in the gallery's growing unrest. Kennedy submitted a detailed timeline linking Thomas's rulings to lobbying efforts, stating, "This is bigger than one fine. It's a pattern of influence." The clerk verified its accuracy, prompting a subdued but powerful cheer. Outside, the crowd swelled into a rally, chanting, "Truth power!" Kennedy, as media coverage exploded, praising Kennedy's leadership. In a side meeting, he directed his team to push for legislation, transparency laws, and oversight panels to ensure real change. Back in court, the senior judge suspended all fines against Kennedy pending federal investigation. Thomas remained silent, isolated as Kennedy closed his briefcase and declared, "We're just getting started. The people deserve a court they can trust." The courtroom, once ruled by Thomas, now echoed with a new voice for Justice Kennedy's and a nation standing behind him. The timer on the ultimatum ticked down to 0, the 48 hours vanishing like smoke in a stiff breeze. And Senator John Kennedy didn't blink, his office uploading the full 61-minute recording to a secure public server with a precision that spoke volumes about his unyielding commitment to transparency. The audio detonated across the digital landscape, high-definition clarity unveiling not just Justice Clarence Thomas's unmistakable voice, but a tangled web of strategy sessions laced with lobbyists and policy insiders. Their words cold and calculated, plotting to wield the $500 million fine as a blunt instrument to discredit Kennedy ahead of pivotal Senate debates. This fine isn't about guilt. It's about making him radioactive, burning his political capital so he wins small but exhausts himself in the process. The gallery of public opinion erupted in virtual courtrooms everywhere, social media platforms exploding with dissected clips, hashtags like #Kennedy Full Tape and #ThomasDown surging to global trends, cable news anchors ditching their scripts to proclaim, "This isn't justice, folks. It's outright sabotage of a public servant." Thomas's once solid alliances fractured like brittle glass. A leaked internal memo from the Supreme Court's chambers revealing raw panic. He's compromised the entire bench retreat now or face total collapse. Kennedy, ever the measured statesman, refused to gloat or bask in the chaos. Instead, he walked into a packed Senate hearing room, his suit as crisp as his resolve, his southern drawl steady and resonant as he took the witness stand under the glare of flashing cameras and the watchful eyes of senators from both sides of the aisle. The chamber buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with the scent of history in the making, as the committee chair, a veteran Republican with a gravelly voice, leaned into his microphone. "Senator Kennedy, your evidence has ripped open a wound in our judicial system. What reforms do you propose to heal it?" Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his sharp blue eyes meeting every gaze in the room, his words deliberate and weighted with purpose. Mandatory quarterly financial disclosures for every federal judge, including those on the Supreme Court. An independent oversight panel armed with subpoena power to root out conflicts. A public digital ledger tracking every ruling linked to private entities or interests. No more operating in shadows, only in the full light of day, where the American people can see and trust. Gasps rippled through the chamber, but they quickly morphed into nods of agreement as bipartisan support swelled like a rising tide. One Democratic senator rising to her feet with a firm declaration, "Kennedy's spot on. This transcends party lines. It's about restoring faith in our democracy." The vote thundered through soon after 308 suspending Justice Thomas indefinitely pending a full criminal review. His nameplate quietly removed from the Supreme Court bench in a subdued ceremony that felt like the closing of a dark chapter. His unmarked black car slipping away into obscurity as he canceled appearances and retreated into silence. Thomas's downfall didn't end with suspension. It cascaded into a series of seismic shifts, the Department of Justice opening cases that led to 2 court clerks resigning amid scrutiny, 3 prominent lobbyists hauled in for subpoenas, and a major law firm once entangled in the web, barred from federal contract work. For a decade, their attempts at backroom deals exposed and dismantled. Kennedy turned down the flood of interview requests and award ceremonies, eschewing personal glory, to focus on the DI legacy of change, returning instead to his Louisiana district for intimate town halls in modest community centers and historic churches where locals gathered under flickering lights. One young man standing to ask with wide-eyed admiration, "How'd you stay so steady through it all?" Senator Kennedy smiled faintly, his voice warm and grounded like the bayou soil. "By keeping in mind who I serve, the hard-working folks back home, not the lofty robes in Washington. It's about standing firm with facts, not folding under pressure." Reforms materialized swiftly and surgically. The Judicial Transparency Act, affectionately dubbed Kennedy's Law by the press and public alike, mandating those disclosures and audits, establishing that third-party panel to ensure ongoing vigilance, a beacon of accountability that rippled through the federal judiciary like a cleansing wave. The Supreme Court itself issued a rare, solemn statement, the Chief Justice's voice grave and reflective. The era of unchecked influence and hidden ties is unequivocally over. We owe the American people a court defined by unassailable accountability. Across the nation, the conversation transformed overnight cable anchors debating judicial power with a newfound urgency rather than blind reverence. Civics classrooms incorporating Kennedy's testimony as core case studies, students in universities from coast to coast, updating their theses to explore themes of ethics and reform, while memes gave way to meaningful dialogues about the balance of power and the role of responsibility in society. In his modest office, Kennedy sifted through stacks of messages from whistleblowers' allies and everyday citizens. His chief of staff leaning in with a question, "Ready for the next battle, Senator?" He nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the window. "Always, because this victory isn't just mine. It's ours." A testament to what happens when we refuse to let power go unchecked. And therein lay the profound lesson woven through every twist of this saga. Standing up against the abuse of authority doesn't merely safeguard one individual. It fortifies the very foundations of our democracy, empowering each of us to wield evidence, persistence, and truth as tools for positive change. It teaches that responsibility as citizens isn't passive. It's active engagement, questioning when systems stray, holding leaders accountable, and building a legacy of integrity that echoes through generations, reminding us all that real justice isn't a distant ideal, but a promise we must actively uphold, fostering a society where every voice can rise without fear, and where the pursuit of fairness becomes the true measure of our collective strength.